On her 79th birthday, my parents left my grandmother Evelyn an unheated, frozen supermarket steak on the table that once fed half the Hudson Valley, then flew to my sister Caitlin's Vail engagement gala. While they toasted champagne, I stayed and lit the candles. The next morning, 2 corporate executives arrived with a thick dossier. One slid a fountain pen to Evelyn, the other told me to sit down. Drop a comment with your city and state. Have you ever watched your family treat the person who built them like a burden? I read every story below. I did not cry. I did not ask why or beg my parents to turn their car around. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I simply tied on my apron and fired up the commercial hearth stove. I began baking the heritage sourdough boules and savory galettes that Evelyn had taught me to shape by hand when I was 9 years old. As the kitchen filled with the familiar, heavy scent of roasted yeast and melting butter, my mind went to work. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I was auditing the bitter arithmetic of my childhood. I had spent 15 years treating their approval like a high-yield bond, hoping it would eventually mature. Instead, it was a Ponzi scheme designed to drain me dry. Every late-night emergency I handled, every sacrifice I made was just another deposit into an account I could never withdraw from. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, paying the premiums while they reaped the dividends. I was the daughter they called when the walk-in cooler failed at midnight. I was the one summoned when cataract consent forms needed a signature. Caitlin, on the other hand, was the golden asset. She was flown across the country for galas, draped in silk, and celebrated for merely existing. I was expected to bear the weight, to be the invisible chain that kept the family machinery running. They had conditioned me to believe that my worth was tied strictly to my utility. That is the invisible chain of the scapegoat caregiver. They do not keep you around because they love you, they keep you around because you are useful. They condition you to confuse exploitation with duty, making you believe that if you just work hard enough, someday you might earn a seat at the table. But the table is rigged. The receipt taped to the frozen steak box read 7:52 a.m. That timestamp was a ledger entry of their character. My parents had dropped off that cold, insulting meal during a 10-minute detour before their 10 o'clock flight. 10 minutes was all the time they could spare for the woman who had financed their entire lives. They viewed her the same way they viewed me, as an exhausted resource. But they had miscalculated. Evelyn was not a depleted asset, and I was no longer an obedient servant. The stove radiated heat against my back as I pulled the first batch of golden loaves from the fire. Evelyn walked into the kitchen, her steps slow but deliberate. She did not look at the frozen box in the trash can. She walked straight to her locked hutch, turned a brass key, and withdrew her aged blue fermentation ledger. She set it on the flour-dusted table, resting her hands on its worn leather cover. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and completely clear of any grief. She whispered that she had already made her birthday wish, and it was time to collect on our investments. The scent of sourdough grounded me. I realized then that my loyalty had been a subscription they were never going to pay for. It was time to cancel their access. Dalton Pierce and Garrett Sterling of Apex Heritage Brands did not look like men who belonged in a flour-dusted farmhouse kitchen. They wore tailored wool suits and carried the kind of quiet authority that usually accompanies vast sums of money. Dalton spread a comprehensive acquisition dossier across the wooden table, the pages crisp and legally binding. They were not here to buy the physical bakery building. They were acquiring the global licensing rights to the Hearth and Mill recipes and our brand name. The initial terms were laid out with clinical precision. $5.6 million paid up front, scaling past $7.2 million in performance royalties over the next 5 years. I stood by the stove, wiping flour from my hands, processing the sheer magnitude of the numbers. My family had spent years trying to figure out how to liquidate Evelyn's legacy, waiting for her mind to slip so they could sell the brick and mortar for a quick profit. They had no idea that Evelyn had been negotiating a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout right under their noses. She had treated her legacy like a blue-chip stock, securing it against hostile takeovers from her own blood. My father had always underestimated her, viewing the bakery as an uncashed check waiting for his signature. He assumed she was merely baking bread, never realizing she was building a commercial empire designed to permanently lock him out. Dalton slid the contract toward her, pointing to a specific clause highlighted in yellow. Evelyn had attached an irrevocable, non-negotiable stipulation to the buyout. Apex Heritage Brands was acquiring the name, but they were not acquiring the soul. I was to be legally designated as the sole custodian of recipes. The contract granted me total veto power over formulation, sourcing, and quality control for the remainder of my life. Apex could not alter a single gram of flour or a single drop of water without my explicit, written authorization. Evelyn picked up the fountain pen and signed her name as the trust's grantor before sliding it to me to countersign as the true intellectual property owner. It was a transaction of trust, a formal transfer of power that bypassed my father entirely. She had effectively locked the family out of the vault. I looked at the signatures drying on the parchment. This was not a gift, it was a fortress. By making me the legal custodian, she had built an impenetrable wall around the heritage yeast culture. Just as Garrett was packing the dossier back into his leather briefcase, my phone vibrated on the counter. It was a frantic text message from our neighbor, Loretta, sent to the main family group chat. She was alerting my parents and sister that suits were on the property and corporate vehicles were parked in the driveway. The silent alarm had been tripped. My parents were hundreds of miles away, toasting to an engagement built on superficial wealth, completely unaware that the real fortune had just been secured. I locked my phone and watched the executives walk out the front door. The transfer of power was complete. I didn't feel giddy or overwhelmed. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. The silent investor had just claimed a majority stake. My parents cut their luxury ski trip short the moment Loretta's text was delivered. They returned to the Hudson Valley with ruthless speed. Gregory and Patricia stormed through the front door without knocking, viewing Evelyn's home not as a sanctuary, but as their own private asset. They treated her existence as a mere placeholder for their future wealth. Gregory immediately deployed a soft, theatrical voice, a weaponized tone of paternal concern designed to manipulate and control. He approached the kitchen table, claiming Evelyn was isolated, fragile, and confused. He demanded copies of whatever corporate documents had been signed. I stepped between him and my grandmother. Anger wasn't loud. It was absolute. I refused his demand, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing my arm and pulling me onto the porch to isolate me. Her mask of maternal warmth dissolved into vicious extortion. She threatened to initiate adult conservatorship proceedings by Monday morning. She promised to drag Evelyn through humiliating competency hearings and tie the estate up in litigation unless I immediately transferred the custodianship rights to the family trust. This is the narcissistic ledger at work. To people like my parents, relationships are strictly instrumental. They do not view family members as human beings. They view them as commodities. Affection is a currency, dispensed only when there is a return on investment. The moment you stop complying, you are no longer a person. You are a defective product that must be managed or discarded. They operate on a delusion of power, believing their empty wallets and hollow status give them the authority to dictate reality. But their ledger was bankrupt, and their threats were built on a foundation of sand. I walked back into the kitchen, Patricia trailing behind me, confident she had struck a fatal blow. But Evelyn had anticipated this exact offensive. She did not panic or raise her voice. Instead, she calmly unlocked a drawer and slid a manila folder across the table. Inside was a certified cognitive evaluation from the chief neurologist at Mount Sinai, dated precisely 3 weeks prior. The document cleared Evelyn of any cognitive decline, definitively certifying her as being of sound mind and fully capable of executing legally binding contracts. Beside the medical clearance, she placed a printed copy of an intercepted email. It was dated October of last year. In it, Gregory had secretly contacted Dalton Pierce, attempting to redirect the preliminary Apex buyout discussions to his personal offshore account. He had tried to steal the company months ago. My father stared at his own digital fingerprint, the theatrical concern completely draining from his face. His extortion attempt had just collided with irrefutable documentation. The conservatorship threat was instantly dismantled. I looked at Patricia, whose hand was still hovering near the doorframe, her threats evaporating into the cold air. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and Evelyn's age for vulnerability. The medical clearance and the fraudulent email were not just defensive shields, they were eviction notices. They had tried to gaslight an empire, but the receipts were flawless. I didn't yell or gloat. I simply looked at my father and realized the extent of his deficit. He wasn't shocked by his own immorality. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along and that Evelyn had audited his lies. The transaction was over. The following afternoon, veteran baker Lorraine Vance summoned me to the dark, flour-dusted back booth of the Hearth and Mill. Lorraine had been with my grandmother for 40 years. She was the silent keeper of the bakery's old records. Without a word of greeting, she slid a yellowed production log from 2016 across the table. I scanned the handwritten entries. A decade ago, while Evelyn was working a double shift at the ovens, Gregory had secretly copied the temperature logs and attempted to sell the proprietary sourdough yeast culture to a massive industrial rival. He had tried to liquidate the very soul of the bakery, but Evelyn had been 10 steps ahead of his corporate espionage. Later that evening, my sister Caitlin texted, asking to meet at a neutral highway diner on the edge of town. When she slid into the booth across from me, the golden child aura was gone, replaced by a hollow, crushing guilt. She had returned from Vail after discovering the ugly truth about her own engagement. Our parents had not financed her wedding out of love. They had orchestrated the marriage to merge with her fiancé's luxury resort chain, planning to liquidate the Hearth and Mill brand as a dowry. Caitlin had been nothing but a bargaining chip. Handing over these stolen corporate files was her first act of true independence, proving she was done being a pawn. I didn't comfort her or offer easy forgiveness. This wasn't a moment for emotional reunions. It was an exchange of critical assets. Shaking, she pushed a heavy folder across the diner table. She had cracked Gregory's home safe and found it buried under tax returns. It was the finalized resort merger contract and a legal rejection letter from his 2016 espionage attempt. Evelyn had not just protected the yeast, she had weaponized it. The rival's legal team had discovered that Evelyn had already legally transferred full intellectual property ownership into an irrevocable trust for me on my 18th birthday. Gregory's 2016 theft had failed, not because the rival company backed out, but because it was legally impossible for him to sell it. He had been trying to broker stolen goods that were registered under my name. My father was not just a terrible parent, he was a serial trade secret thief. Armed with these certified documents, I drove straight back to the farmhouse. Gregory had sent 3 voicemails offering a private, discreet family settlement to make the Apex deal go away. Evelyn sat by the fire, listening to the desperate recordings with cold detachment. I looked at the woman who had spent a decade playing an intricate game of chess to protect me. She shook her head, her voice devoid of mercy. There would be no private settlement. We were not going to sweep this corporate felony under the rug of family privacy. She decreed that the town, the people who had eaten our bread and watched us bleed for this business, would serve as the only jury. Gregory had weaponized his public image to oppress us for decades. Now, we were going to use that exact same public stage to dismantle him. The accounting was clear. The debt was due. Over 80 townspeople, regional journalists, and Apex executives packed the floor of the Hearth and Mill for the official line preview. The scent of roasted sourdough hung heavy in the air, but the atmosphere was entirely clinical. Gregory brazenly seized the microphone near the display cases, performing his role as the aggrieved, protective patriarch. He projected a theatrical paternal concern, warning the hushed crowd that opportunistic corporate predators had taken advantage of his mother's declining mental state. It was a masterful, sickening performance designed to invalidate the Apex buyout and retain control of the narrative. I didn't panic. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. With Evelyn's hand resting firmly on my back, I stepped out from the shadows of the prep kitchen and walked directly into the spotlight. I bypassed Gregory entirely, plugging my laptop into the bakery's main projection system. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply let the documentation speak. First, I projected the 7:52 a.m. receipt for the frozen supermarket meal, establishing his character. Next, the screen flashed to the fraudulent October emails where Gregory had attempted to illegally redirect the Apex buyout funds into his offshore account. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but I wasn't finished. I clicked to the final slide. projecting only the redacted cover and signature pages of the bombshell Biological Intellectual Property Trust bearing my name in bold, notarized ink. The room went dead silent. Gregory's face drained of color as he stared at the 50-foot projection of his own criminal failure. Before he could formulate a lie, Caitlin stepped forward from the front row. She didn't cry. She reached out, pulled the microphone directly from our father's trembling hand, and spoke with absolute clarity. She exposed the marriage for liquidation scheme, detailing exactly how Gregory and Patricia had planned to sell out the town's heritage to fund a resort merger. As she spoke, she laid the physical, original resort merger contract on the counter next to the sourdough loaves. The illusion of the perfect, wealthy family shattered instantly. Patricia, realizing the social capital she worshipped had just evaporated, grabbed Gregory by the arm. She dragged her disgraced husband out through the heavy blue bakery doors. They walked into a crushing, absolute community silence. No one shouted. No one booed. The town simply watched them default on their reputation and leave empty-handed. The executives from Apex Heritage Brands watched the corporate execution with quiet respect, recognizing that the true value of the company lay in our unyielding integrity. Gregory's departure was not a retreat. It was an eviction. The silence that followed him out the door was the sound of a toxic account being permanently closed. We had stripped them of their leverage, their public mask, and their financial lifeblood. Evelyn slowly walked to the front counter and took the microphone from Caitlin. She surveyed the room, her posture straight, her gaze piercing. "I am 79 years old," she said, her voice echoing clearly off the subway tile walls. "I am not confused. I am not fragile. I know exactly who abandoned me, and I know exactly who stayed." The climax was not a screaming match. It was a hostile takeover executed with absolute precision. My father had tried to steal an empire, but he had been outmaneuvered by a grandmother who kept meticulous records and a daughter who had finally stopped serving as a silent partner. The Sunday edition of the county paper published a factual, irrefutable exposé outlining the corporate espionage, permanently branding Gregory and Patricia as social outcasts. A week later, Gregory attempted to corner me in the bakery's parking lot, pitching a desperate, frantic plea for a reasonable family split. I shut him down with unyielding calm. I didn't yell. I simply looked at him and stated that the estate was closed, the accounts were locked, and he was officially bankrupt of any family equity. Caitlin returned to the bakery the next morning. She tied on a heavy canvas apron and began earning her redemption one grueling 4 o'clock morning shift at a time, scrubbing the industrial mixers under Evelyn's watchful eye. Restitution is not granted. It is earned through physical labor. Later that afternoon, in the quiet warmth of the farmhouse kitchen, Evelyn formally handed me the master blue ledger. I opened the worn cover to find a newly penned sourdough formulation dedicated simply for Morgan. Taking possession of that ledger felt like closing a massive, lifelong audit. This is the justice of the sower. The narcissist believes that because they own the field, they own the harvest, but the earth only answers to the hands that bleed into it. The sower's justice dictates that the one who stays, the one who waters the roots in the dark, is the only one who inherits the bloom. The cold detour my parents took to drop off that frozen meal was the catalyst that ended their reign. They had assumed my silence was a sign of weakness, an agreement to remain in the shadows while they basked in the warmth of stolen success. They were wrong. Every early morning, every burnt finger, every hour spent tending the mother yeast was a silent accumulation of power. We did not destroy them. We merely let them destroy themselves. It taught me that endurance must eventually give way to decisive, structural action. For a long time, I believed that enduring emotional abuse was a sign of loyalty. I believed that if I just absorbed enough of their cruelty, I could keep the peace. I've come to realize that keeping the peace for people who actively wage war against your soul is the ultimate form of self-destruction. True empowerment means firing the people who consistently undervalue you. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free, by permanently walking away. Generational healing doesn't start with endless compromise and forced holiday dinners. It starts with a severed contract. It starts when you look at the balance sheet of your life, calculate the emotional deficit, and stop issuing credit to those who continually default on your heart. My family expected me to be the invisible mortar holding their bricks together. Instead, I became the architect of their foreclosure. If there is someone in your life who quietly stays, bears the weight, and never gets invited to the mountaintops, share this story with them today. Remind them that staying was never invisible. It was an investment that will eventually pay out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.